Welcome to our next discipleship class. So today what we're going to go through is, or at least try to get through it, is the Ezekiel 38 war. I'd like to look at the nations that are involved and kind of walk through the verses. I know that Ezekiel 38 and 39 together are a package deal. These chapters tell us of a war that has not yet occurred. So a lot of people have had questions about this, so I want to be able to walk through this and answer those questions for you. So let's first of all go through some background. Leading up to this chapter, 38, the regathering of Israel is described in both chapter 36 and 37. It's really the key to timing the event of the war, which is one of the reasons why we know that it has not yet happened, other than the fact that the events in that chapter have not yet occurred. This is one of the major wars we see described in the Bible, right? The first one was the War of the Five Kings back in Genesis 14, where Abraham went out, rescued Lot, and those in Sodom, and then returned back, saw Melchizedek. So that was the first kind of main war we see. The most familiar with people is that of Armageddon in Revelation 16. Again, that has not occurred yet. I think a lot of times that gets confused with some of the Hollywood stuff. Hollywood understands Armageddon as something of biblical proportions, whatever that is, and so it's kind of like, the world war to end all world wars and all that, but Armageddon is a very specific war. It definitely, I guess, for the most part, could be classified as almost a world war. But either way, it has not happened yet, and it is in relation to what happens in the Middle East, specifically in the Valley of Megiddo, with the Antichrist and the armies of the East coming to that war, as well as other Gentile nations. There's the final Magog War in Revelation 20, which is at the end of the 1,000-year reign of Christ. Now, because Gog and Magog are mentioned in that war, many people have confused that with here in Ezekiel 38. Using the same names is not aligning with the same war. It's the same problem that people have when they read the word trumpet in the Bible. So they read trumpet and then they figure, then the word trumpet, you connect them all together and they're all the same trumpets, which is not true. The last trump of the rapture is not the judgment trumpets in the book of Revelation, the seven trumpets. So they're each very different. They need to be held distinct from one another because they have a different purpose. They are not accomplishing the same thing, no different than, if you were in the military, you get up in the morning. We used to have to, they played reveille, and then you put the flag up, and then at the end of the day, you take the flag down. So there's a different trumpet sound for each to notify you. So this is not either of those wars explained as we move into the text. So this war takes up 2 chapters, more than Armageddon or any other key war. Interestingly enough, there's more detail given to us about this war than any other. This war, by its description, has not occurred in the past up until now. It's after Chapter 36 and 37 are accomplished. We're watching those chapters fulfill before our eyes in history right now, with Israel returning to the land. So they're back in their land. However, they are in unbelief. Eventually that will be changed to belief later to fulfill what is being spoken of as not only the physical nation brought back to populate Israel in these previous chapters, but also spiritually they will be turning to believe that Jesus of Nazareth is their Messiah and crying out for him to return. All right, so questions we need to answer in order to understand the chapter better. First, who are the allied nations involved? Does Ukraine have a part? Now, Ukraine obviously has been in the news. We're watching what's happening over there, and because Russia is a key player in the Ezekiel 38 war, then people want to know, is this what's fulfilling what the Bible is talking about? When is the battle going to occur? We'll talk about that. We'll get all this out of the text, by the way. Why will the battle occur? What can we learn from it? In other words, what we're really understanding about this Ezekiel 38 war. What is the lesson for us? So hopefully we'll answer all these questions for you as we walk through the text. So first of all, who are the nations? So let's just start out with verse 1 and 2. Now the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Son of man, set your face against Gog of the land of Magog, the prince of Rosh, Meshach, and Tubal, and prophesy against him. So, first, Gog is mentioned as the prince of Rosh, Meshach, and Tubal. If you have an old King James, it incorrectly actually translates the word Rosh, a proper name, and they translate it chief prince, which is a common noun, and it can be misleading. So Rosh is actually a proper name, and we'll get into that. So Gog, which is a proper noun, has been variously identified, but here it's evident that Gog of the land of Magog, the prince of Rosh, who is leading this whole band of nation, the prince of the allied nations of war. In other words, he is the head, the leader in that sense. So Louis Bowman, in his Russian Events in Light of Bible Prophecy, it's 1942, says it is interesting to note that the very word Caucasus means Gog's fort. Gog and Chazen, which is fort, are two of the Oriental words from which it is derived. So, the Caucasus Mountains up there in near the Black Sea, the Baltic Sea. So you have basically in the southern Russia area, the northern Turkey area, and up as you look at a map up there. So Gog is from the area of Russia. That's pretty clear. And Gog is leading this coalition of nations to attack Israel. Now the question is, will Gog be a man or a demonic entity behind the coalition of nations? So in Daniel 10, and that's a question that comes up, like, is Gog a person? Is he the leader of Russia? Is he a demonic being? Because like in Daniel 10, we have the demonic entity of the Prince of Persia that actually was withstanding the answer to Daniel's prayer, and then there was a fight. It took 3 weeks for Daniel to get the answer that he had prayed about. So the Prince of Persia was obviously not a human entity. It's the demonic beings that are behind these Gentile nations and moving them to do what it is that they do. In Ezekiel 28, we have the Prince of Tyre. They're obviously there. Though the prophecy starts out talking about the Prince of Tyre, it obviously goes beyond to talk about Satan. So the Prince of Tyre was not in the Garden of Eden, and the way that it's described, it's obviously talking about the devil. So these are demonic entities, obviously, in these texts that move the nations of the world, directing them under Satan's control. Even at the Battle of Armageddon, we read in Revelation 16:14, We have spirits of demons performing signs which go out to the kings of the earth and of the whole world to gather them to the battle of that great day of God Almighty. So there is a spiritual wickedness that operates behind, this kind of veil of what we can see in this world, in this physical world, into the spiritual world. And they operate manipulating and influencing the move of nations as well as individuals. So Satan is very organized. We learn in Ephesians 6, Paul says that there are principalities, powers, rulers, right? Spiritual wickedness in high places. That's what we're battling against. And the description of that is really talking about a very organized governmental structure that Satan has organized and is executing on. So it's like in a sense, the spiritual shadow government behind the governments of the world, because again, Satan's the god of this world. Jesus twice, or actually 3 times in the Gospel of John, called him the ruler of this world. Paul calls him in Ephesians 2:2 the prince of the power of the air that even now works in the children of disobedience. So we know that there is spiritual forces at work that are accomplishing what Satan wants to do. And because our original parents, Adam and Eve, have turned over the dominion and control and rulership that they were given by God in the Garden of Eden when they sinned, man has lost that control, and the influence of the demonic realm behind the scenes is really the controlling entity and why you see the world in the mess that it's in. Now, does that mean it's out of God's control? Absolutely not. God is sovereign. And the interesting thing is that God is still, though these demonic beings have the freedom and man has his freedom, somehow God uses all that and will still work it according to the purpose of his plan. And we know that he's going to do that because he's already written about it in advance in the Bible. So we have all that, which means that God is in control. God is not determining what they do. There are points, obviously, where God takes over sovereignly and accomplishes what he wants, but only God has the capability of allowing freedom and yet accomplishing his plan and purpose at the same time. In Revelation 20, verse 7, it says, "Now when the 1,000 years have expired," this is during the millennial reign, "Satan will be released from his prison," because he's chained up for 1,000 years, "and will go out to deceive the nations which are in the 4 corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them together to battle, whose number is as the sand of the sea." So obviously we're talking about large numbers. Now, that Gog exists at the end of the 1,000-year reign seems to lend towards it being a demonic being, since it's a proper name, and the same exists 1,000 years later. Now, obviously, it can certainly be a proper name in reference to Russia, but either way, we're still not looking at the same war. But the prophecy is against him as he rules the nations. So the next is Magog, which means land of Gog. So again, also a proper noun and the name of a land previously indwelt by the Scythians. We find this out from Josephus, who is a 1st century historian many of you are familiar with, and other historians as well. The Scythians were descended from Ashkenaz, the son of Gomer, the son of Japheth, as listed in Genesis 10, the Table of Nations. That's the original. Those are the original nations that the rest of the Bible uses as an identifier so that we know what's being referenced. So a lot of times we will read a name in the Bible that is not the exact same of the name today. For example, we'll get to Iran. Actually, before Iran was called Iran in 1935, it was called Persia. So the Bible always calls it Persia. It's not going to change and call it Iran. We see in Russia, for example, St. Petersburg had its name change, from Leningrad because they didn't want the negative connotation, so they changed it to St. Petersburg. So the names of places change, but in the Bible, the original table of nations remains the names that are used throughout. Byzantine and Arabian writers of the 10th century were familiar with a people who were Scythians, mountaineers dwelling north of the Taurus Mountains on the shores of the Black Sea and the banks of the Volga River. So, again, we see the reference to the area where the Scythians lived, right? Jerome in the 4th century said the Jews of this age understood by Magog the vast and innumerable nations of Scythia, about Caucasus Mountains stretching along the Caspian Sea to India. So we're dealing with that whole area. Keil and Delitzsch, I've quoted them before, Jewish theologians. They have a commentary, Old Testament Hebrew commentary. Also identify them, Magog, as the Scythian people. Herodotus, 150 years after Ezekiel, has a lot to say about the Scythians and places them from northern Asia Minor to Russia and east to China. So they covered a pretty good area. As far as he was concerned, Josephus 161 says, Magog founded those that from him were named Magogites, but who are by the Greeks called Scythians. So you see how the connection comes together, and quite a bit is known about the Scythians. They unearthed many Scythians remains in Siberia and southern Russia, northern Turkey areas, and they spread as far as China with the Magogian Wall, which we know as the Great Wall of China, but originally it was the Magogian Wall because they were trying to actually protect themselves from the Scythians, who were very dangerous, and separate them in that way. Next is Rosh. So again, proper noun. There's good evidence that this is what we know as Russia today. So again, Keil and Delitzsch tell us Byzantine and Arabic writers frequently mention a people called Rus, reckoned among the Scythian tribes, so that there is no reason to question the existence of a people known by the name Rosh. So again, when you have a people that inhabit the same geographical location, then you realize that, that's those people. Fawcett, from Jameson, Fawcett, and Brown, tells us Rosh is the tribe north of the Taurus Range and near Ra or Volga, which gives them their name, the earliest trace of the Rus nation. Wilhelm Gesenius, Hebrew and Chaldee lexicon, Samuel Bagster and Sons, 1847, that's when it was printed. So Israel wasn't even back in their land, right? He says, without much doubt, Rosh designates the Russians, who were described by multiple Byzantine writers of the 10th century under the name of Rus. They spoke of the rustic Scythians being of North Crimea. So again, we see from history, we get this information to tell us who they are. So Gog is the prince of Rosh, in other words, the prince of a geographical location. Now, regarding Meshech and Tubal, in the 400s BC, the Greeks speak of them as Muscoi and Tabarini in northern Asia Minor, at the southeastern edge of the Black Sea or the Caucasus region. Herodotus recorded that when Persian Emperor Xerxes I set out to conquer Greece in 480 BC, The Moscovians and Tiberanians were among the troops listed. So again, we see the similarity here. By the 1st century AD, the descendants of Meshech and Tubal were located around the Caucasus region in modern-day Georgia. Now, that would be, essentially the edge of Russia down there. Right next to them were situated the Tiberini or Tiberinians. Josephus called these descendants of Tubal the Iberes or Iberians, which comes from dropping the T on the name, essentially. Based on geographic location, it is no coincidence that the descendants of Tubal, called Tiberanians and later Iberians, finally settled in the area called Siberia today. So that would be up obviously in Russia, in Siberia. So we go on in verses 3 to 6. It says, "And say, Thus says the Lord God, Behold, I am against you, O Gog, the prince of Rosh, Meshech, and Tubal. I will turn you around, put hooks in your jaws, and lead you out with all your army, horses and horsemen, all splendidly clothed, a great company of bucklers and shields, all of them handling swords. Persia, Ethiopia, and Libya are with them, all of them with shield and helmet. Gomer and all its troops, the house of Togarmah, from the far north, and all its troops, many people are with you." So that's Ezekiel 38, 3 to 6. So the phrase "turn you around" is in Hebrew grammar really gives the idea of a change of plans. So again, Keel says, "In the words I place rings in thy jaws," Ezekiel 29:4. Gog is represented as an unmanageable beast, and that should be probably Ezekiel 39. No, actually 29:4. Okay, which is compelled to follow its leader, and the thought is thereby expressed that Gog is compelled to obey the power of God against his will. I will bring out to lead him away from his land or natural soil. So there's going to be something that draws them down. Now, God is working at the same time. They will have their own evil understanding of what they want to accomplish. So who are the nations, the allied nations to Magog? Well, first is Persia. Now, again, this is Iran. The name was changed from Persia in 1935 under the Reza Shah Pahlavi, and Persia historically really were friends of Israel. We know that from reading the Old Testament. Cyrus, mentioned in Isaiah 44, sent Zerubbabel to rebuild the temple. So Zerubbabel and Joshua the high priest were there in Ezra, chapters 1 to 6, and then Ezra obviously engaged and went later on, though the book is named Ezra. And then Artaxerxes in Ezra 7 to 10 adorned the temple and helped reform the people. This was where Ezra himself was involved. Then Artaxerxes Longimanus sent Nehemiah to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. We see that from Nehemiah chapter 1 and 2. And this was, if you read The Coming Prince by Sir Robert Anderson, he'll tell you that command to go forth and rebuild Jerusalem was March 14th, 445 BC. When did things begin to change in Iran? Well, the Persians changed, this is a little Iran history, the Persians changed the name to Iran to show a new beginning. Note that throughout history, the Iranians maintained their name Iran and its equivalents. The problem, though, was with its exonyms. In case you don't know, exonyms are how the international community calls a country. So the international community referred to the Iranians as Persians. This did not go down well with the Iranians, since especially after foreign interventions, the British and Soviet activities in the country had crippled the country's economy, and they were trying to take advantage of Iran's recent oil discovery. So this is obviously quite some time ago. The crippled economy gave the Iranians a bad image in the eyes of other countries. So when Reza Shah overthrew the Qajars, which was a dynasty which was of Turkish origin out of the Qajar tribe in 1925, he decided to restore Iran's glory. He embarked on several projects to boost the economy and image of the country. Part of his strategy was to change its exonym from Persia to Iran. So Reza Shah wrote a memorandum asking that all nations call the country Iran, and issued the edict for the name change in 1935, 10 years after he had come to power. Before that, Persia was a divided territory ruled by the Qajars for over 100 years. When Reza Shah assumed power, he unified and modernized the country. So you can see the internet reference to that underneath there down below. Now, the Ayatollah Khomeini became the supreme religious leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran in 1979, following many years of resistance from Shah Pahlavi. Following his appointment as Ayatollah, Khomeini worked to remove the Shah from power for his associations with the West. Upon the success of the revolutionary, Ayatollah Khomeini was named religious and political leader of Iran for life. So again, this is kind of the development of Iran and why they are so against Israel today, as well as us. On February 1st, 1979, the Ayatollah Khomeini returns to Iran in triumph after 15 years of exile. The Shah and his family had fled the country 2 weeks before, and jubilant Iranian revolutionaries were eager to establish a fundamentalist Islamic government under Khomeini's leadership. In 1941, British and Soviet troops occupied Iran and installed Mohammad Reza Pahlavi as the second modern Shah of Iran. The new Shah had close ties with the West, which is, again, why they wanted to get him out. Mohammad Reza embraced many Western ideas, and in 1963 launched a broad government program that called for the reduction of religious estates in the name of land redistribution, equal rights for women, and other modern reforms, which the Ayatollah Khomeini was not very happy with, and a lot of his revolutionary followers. So what's Iran's current view of the USA? So Ettinger can give us some insight. He's an Israeli researcher, diplomat, writer, lecturer, and consultant to his Israeli and U.S. legislators and their staffers. This is currently. He is an expert on U.S.-Israel relations, Middle East affairs, and Jewish-Arab demography. So he's right there able to tell us. So he says, Iranian school textbooks such as the Quran and Life prepare Iranian children for the Ayatollah's sublime goal. The apocalyptic, horrifying, millenarian military battle against the USA and other arrogant oppressors of the world, which are ostensibly led by idolatrous devils, while the Savior, the infallible, immortal, divinely ordained, and eventual global leader, the Mahdi, and the Mahdi is really who Islam looks for as kind of the coming Messiah, okay, has not surfaced yet. Iranian children are taught that the battle is already raging throughout the world, awaiting their sacrifice. School textbooks of modern democracies are the most authentic reflection of people's values and worldview. School textbooks of tyrannies are the most authentic reflection of the nature and mission of the regimes. Iranian school textbooks reflect the strategy and tactics of the Ayatollahs much more authentically than speeches, interviews, diplomatic statements, and conversations conducted by President Rouhani and Foreign Minister Zarif. So, again, this is a relatively modern posting, but the point is that in school, the Iranian kids are brought up to believe that we are creating the problem and we are the idolatrous devils, as well as Israel and them the like. So, when did things begin to change? Now, the next nation is Ethiopia. So some Bibles may actually put the word Cush in there for Ethiopia, but that's the Hebrew, the area of the Sudan and Ethiopia in some combination. So Ethiopia is not really far off the mark as far as usage. The Sudan is deadly right now to Christians and others not part of the Islamic leadership there. We know that it's dangerous if you are involved in any kind of missionary reading or anything. You know that right now over in the Sudan, Christians are losing their lives just because they are Christians. So you have these hostile regimes, which, quite frankly, though is another matter, our policies in the current administration, especially with Iran, are a little bit scary from a human standpoint, certainly, because you certainly don't want to be negotiating and giving money and support to a country that is a country of terrorism that has basically sworn to remove you from the earth because you are a threat. So why you would basically pay your enemy to kill you, I have no idea. So after that, we have Libya, which in the Hebrew is called Put, and it's North Africa next to Egypt on the Mediterranean Sea. So according to the CIA fact book, the following terror groups are in Libya: Ansar al-Sahara groups, right? Islamic State of Iraq and Asham are in Libya. Al-Muthuman battalion, and then Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. So we see these groups that are in Libya right now, and that's currently in the CIA fact book. Also from the CIA fact book on ASL, goals, this is what it says about them: a strict implementation of Sharia, that's Sharia law, that's Islamic law in Libya, targets, tactics, and weapons. They targets Libyan political and security officials and Westerners for kidnappings, executions, bombings, and assassinations. Financial and other support: obtained funds from Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, writing and underwriting Islamic charities, donations from sympathizers, and criminal activities. Raided Libyan military bases for weapons and ammunition. Not a kind group, not at all. So how about Gomer, the area of western Turkey, really into Germany? Some commentators think Gomer is Germany, but it's certainly up in that area of Turkey into Germany. Gomer founded those people. The Greeks now called Galatians, the Gauls, but were then called Gomerites from Josephus. The House of Togarmah is some of Turkey and Armenia, geographically, who still calls themselves the House of Togarmah in that area. These are coming with troops from the far north. Now, obviously, far north of the area of Turkey and Armenia is Russia. So what is the common thread that we could only know about today? They're Islamic nations. There's a Muslim connection. This is interesting because prior to that, prior to a lot of these nations falling to Islam and really getting established as Islamic nations, there was no reason which a lot of ancient commentators could see to connect these nations together. In other words, you need to have a common thread. I mean, it's like doing some detective work. Detectives go on to a crime scene, and they have to be able to put the evidence together. If multiple people are involved in a crime, they look for what the common denominator is, what is tying them together. People don't just randomly come together for the heck of it. Russia will grow increasingly as Islamic. In 1991, there were 300 mosques in Russia. According to a 210 census in Russia, there are 8,000. So that's a pretty good exponential growth, if you really consider it. So basically, in effectively 29 years, you've gone from a few hundred to 8,000 mosques, and there's been estimations that there's thousands more at this point. So as you look at this map, you see the connection with kind of the geographic locations, and the connection as you look at them coming down into little little Israel there that Ezekiel is talking about. So this kind of lays it out for you. And so to summarize the allied nations, Magog is Central Asia, Rosh is Russia, Meshech, Tubal, Togarmah are Turkey and Armenia, Gomer is the Galatian region of Turkey, probably into Germany, Persia is Iran, Ethiopia is Ethiopia and the Sudan. They kind of connect together where they used to be. Libya is Put, and that's northern Africa. Sheba and Dedan, which we'll get into, is Saudi Arabia and or Yemen. Tarshish would be Spain, which we haven't touched on yet. And the merchants of Tarshish, which we haven't touched on yet, is Europe and Western countries that have extended from them. These are not involved, the merchants of Tarshish, but tend to ask kind of why the attack is happening. And so, we'll get into that. So why don't we stop here at the beginning of verse 7, and then because we'll end up going easily past an hour. So we'll do part 2 next week. We'll continue to follow on, but you can read ahead. I mean, you have the Bible just like, anybody, and so you can read ahead and get a good idea of where we're going for this. And then hopefully if you have any questions, we'll answer them as we move forward on this. So until next week, may God richly bless you as you continue to study His Word.